guys, it's Aoife from Words of Clover and I am here to do my July reading wrap up. So I got loads of books read in July, so I will get straight on into this wrap up because I have loads of books to talk about and I have lots of opinions on those books. So the first book that I finished since the last time I spoke to you is The Rabbit Queen by Dexter. Now this is a book that I originally picked up for the June Buzzwordathon, which is happening throughout the year, and this book is based on quite an interesting real life story about a woman called Mary Toft. She managed to fool a bunch of surgeons and doctors way back in the 1700s that she was giving birth to rabbits, and these rabbits were coming out like completely dismembered, they were dead, and it just really stumped all the physicians who were treating her. This story we're mostly seeing the point of view from her original doctor who treated her, so the village doctor, and then the village doctor's apprentice. Their first encounter with Mary, her family, her husband, and then how the story kind of just blows up from there, from the first like rabbit that she gives birth to. And eventually this doctor and his apprentice, they travel to London, and the story was quite interesting because it's obviously based on like a true thing that happened, and it's always interesting to see stories based around people in the medical field back in this type of time period. Story did kind of get a little bit boring and bland for me because like there's only so much repetition of like how many rabbits this woman can give birth to, and it kind of kept happening again and again, and I kind of was waiting for something new. We did eventually get that when they moved to London, and seeing London from the point of view from particularly the apprentice's view, and like he's a kind of a country boy, he's never been in the city before, and there were some kind of interesting takes on London, and on London being kind of almost like a hive and treating London as one being rather than a bunch of individuals. And I found that kind of outlook on London at the time and like this big city. I did feel overall disappointed in this book. As I said, there are parts of it that got a little bit boring for me, but there was also one part when they were in London that there was this really horrible case of animal cruelty in the book that I just felt like didn't really need to be there. It was there kind of for shock value, it was there to kind of really shock the young character that we're following as well, to really kind of disassociate himself with London and not really want to be in London anymore. But also, yeah, I just felt very sick reading that, and I actually skimmed the few pages that was happening because I actually just couldn't really deal with it. It was just really horrible case of animal cruelty, and it kind of ended up, because it was near the end of the book, I ended up finishing the book in kind of like a sour taste, which wasn't great. So I gave this book a 2 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was Patsy by Nicole Dennis Benn. This is a very interesting book. It's kind of historical because it's set in, I can guess, like the 90s and the early noughties, and it's kind of weird to say that's historical, but yeah, it's set kind of around the 90s, early noughties. We are following a woman called Patsy who grows up in Jamaica, and at the very start of the book we know that she is after being granted like a visa to travel to America, where she's going to leave her mother and her young child behind in Jamaica, and she's going to go and travel to America and stay in America then illegally and try and basically make a life for herself and maybe like send back money to her daughter and to her mother and support them. A lot of other reasons why Patsy wants to go to America. One of these is to reunite with a childhood friend of hers who is actually like a former lover, and she, you know, she really expects this type of life that she's going to be living in America, and then once she gets to America she's hit with all those closed doors, then not having like a proper work visa or a permit, like what that means for her and the way she has to live and the way she has to look for jobs, in the way the type of jobs that she is granted. Like it's really, this book is a really great way of showing how like undocumented like immigrants in America, and though like I guess all over the world, but particularly in America, like how the struggle of having to live a life in America while being undocumented, the amount of like things that like you just can't do, and the amount of things that you have to worry about, like things like living, like rent, you know, bank accounts, like all these kind of different things. I really love that part of this book. I think Patsy in general, like I've seen other people review this book and they found it very hard to I guess connect to Patsy because she's left her daughter behind, and we then see her struggle to even contact her daughter once she's over in America. She almost wants to completely distance herself from her daughter, and we're also seeing the point of view of her daughter. Her daughter is called True, and how True grows up in Jamaica believing her mother has abandoned her to America, and True is going through kind of a real journey with her identity, particularly her gender identity and what she's comfortable in, her sexuality and her identity. And we're seeing her struggle like without her mother, and we're seeing Patsy's guilt then, and yet her anguish and her guilt, but then also her relief that she doesn't have to be a mother, because like, you know, she just wants to be her, she wants to be Patsy, she wants to go out and find love herself, and she doesn't want to, I guess, be held back by the expectations that are on her as a mother. And yeah, so this is a very interesting kind of exploration around like being an immigrant, being a mother, being a queer woman, being a queer black woman as well. And yeah, I really enjoyed this. I think this is one that like, it's not for everyone, because I've seen some people, as I said, they found it very hard to connect to Patsy and to feel sorry for her because of how she distanced herself from her daughter. But I just thought that really like brought an element into the book that I really enjoyed, and I really loved kind of what the book was trying to say, what the author was trying to say about, you know, the identity of a mother as well, and the identity of oneself separate away from being a mother, if that makes sense. But yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, and I definitely recommend it for people to read. Next book I read was The Autumn Throne by Elizabeth Chadwick. This is the third and final book in the Summer Queen trilogy, which is all about Eleanor of Aquitaine. This book basically is around like the last 30 or 40 years of Eleanor of Aquitaine's life. So we see the very end of her husband's reign, who was like one of the early King Henrys, then her son's reign, who was King Richard the Lionheart, and then King John. And we kind of see how she has such a pivotal role to play in like all these kings, like their reigns, and what an amazing political figure she was at the time, what a like powerful person she was at the time, how all these people in her life really appreciated like her wisdom and her guidance. And like, it kind of, in a way, this book really shows like what a pity it was that she couldn't just be a ruler on her own, and because of her gender. I would definitely like recommend this book for people who like Philippa Gregory, like Alison Weir, all those type of books. You would most likely really enjoy Elizabeth Chadwick's writing. I gave this one, I think it was a 3.5 out of 5 stars, and I did enjoy it, but the first book in this trilogy is definitely my favourite one. After that, I finished my audiobook, which was Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. This is a book that I've heard a lot about, and I've finally ended up picking it up, kind of out of curiosity, to be honest, because I know there's going to be a movie about it soon, and it was available on my library via audiobook. So I decided to give it a go, and I actually really enjoyed this one. This is set in kind of the 50s in the marshlands in like southern America, and we are following a young girl called Kaya, who at a very young age, her entire family basically abandoned her, and she's living alone in this marsh. She's completely uneducated, and she ends up having to fend for herself through like her knowledge of the marsh, and just through kind of her, like, I guess, intelligence, really, like just basic instinct. She has to try and figure out how to fend for herself, and how to make sure like the authorities don't like realise that she's living alone as well. She ends up striking up a friendship with another young boy who lives in her area, and he eventually ends up teaching her to read and write, and kind of giving her education. And then from there she becomes this like really intelligent scholar of the nature around her. And we also were getting kind of like a present and past storyline. We're getting a past storyline of Kaya growing up, and then we were getting a present storyline of a body being found in the marsh, and how people seem to think that this body leads back to Kaya, and we're kind of watching her grow up, wondering, does she like grow up to become a murderer? Who is this body? How is it related to her? And yeah, so that mystery is growing throughout the book. I really enjoyed this one. I was like pleasantly surprised by how invested I was in the story. I think the audiobook was really good. I would definitely recommend the audiobook for anyone looking to read this, because I really enjoyed the audiobook. And yeah, I just felt so invested in this. I was like doing my little like diamond painting that I'm doing at the moment, though I haven't actually touched it in a while, but when I was listening to this, that's what I was doing. And I just like, yeah, I could have just sat there for hours and read this whole thing through the audiobook, because yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was really good. So I gave this one a really strong 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read is a fantasy book, and it is the second book in a series, and it's The Shadow Saint by Gareth Hanrahan. This is the second book in the Black Iron Legacy trilogy, I think it is going to be, and the first book was The Gutter Prayer, which I read at the end of last year. And this is kind of a hard fantasy book like world to explain, so bear with me for a minute. But this is basically set in a world where gods are kind of like are real, they exist, and they can basically like appear to people. They can choose people to be like their avatars, or to like to act for them on like Earth, and then they can also fight with each other. So the best way I can explain this is like if you think about that scene in like Disney's Hercules where like the Titans and the gods are like fighting against each other. This is basically happening all the time in this world, and the gods are fighting against each other. They're kind of making certain humans into their puppets. They can grant them with powers, while like kind of using and abusing them down on Earth, and you know, increasing the war that way as well. And some cities are being destroyed, and we are following characters in this one city that's kind of basically like Switzerland in this like mess that's happening. They don't believe in one particular god, and their gods are quite weak, so they don't really like come to life in that way. And because of that, the gods, all the other gods kind of leave them alone. They're kind of known as like being neutral territory. And in the first book we followed 3 different characters who were kind of like bandit characters while they were on a particular heist, and the heist went wrong, and something happened where these really terrible type of gods could have been unleashed onto the city, and the characters that we are following basically tried to stop that. And in this second book we are following, from the fallout of the first book, we are following a few different characters. We are seeing what happened to the city after the almost disaster of the first book. We're seeing how politics are played in the new and improved city almost, and then also how the gods that were fighting in far off cities are now actually looking on this city called Gurdon. They're looking on this city to like, and they're kind of seeing it as a rival now, and they're going to approach and possibly like obliterate it. I always find it really hard to try and describe what's happening in this book series. This I enjoyed. I really liked the political play that was going on in this book. I really liked the build up of what's going to happen in the third book, the type of creatures that are going to happen in the third book. I really enjoyed this one. If you're just like if you're a high fantasy lover, I would definitely recommend this one. Maybe not for fantasy newbies, but if you do enjoy a really good high fantasy one that's like really kind of meaty, has a lot of substance to it, and there's a lot of lore, there's a lot of city, there's a lot of geography going on, and there's a lot of world building. Not too much world building actually, a bit more world building in this one than there was in the first one, but yeah, you would really enjoy this one. So I gave this one a 4 out of 5 stars. Red was one I really enjoyed, and that was Dial A for Aunties by Sutano, and this is a book that was just such a riot. This was just pure fun, and I had just so much enjoyment reading this book. This book we are following a girl called Maddie who has been kind of basically raised by her mother, and then her mother, like her bunch of aunties, and they're kind of like this one big crazy loud family, and they all own this kind of wedding business together. And one day Maddie is set up on a blind date by her mother and her auntie, and things go really wrong, and she kind of ends up killing him. And instead of like talking to the police or like, you know, trying to figure out what to do, she ends up calling her mother and her aunties about this body that she is now, you know, has to deal with. And they basically decide they're going to hide the body, but first they have to do this wedding that they are planning to do, like this big wedding, the biggest wedding they've ever like had on their books. They have to do this wedding first. So you're basically at this massive wedding while they're trying to hide a body, and there's just a whole lot of drama ensued. And then Maddie's ex is also at this wedding, and there's still kind of a little bit of like flames and like emotion there between the two of them, so she's also kind of dealing with that while also trying to get rid of a dead body. This book like wasn't very realistic, like you kind of had to just take it with a grain of salt, but it was so funny, it was so heartwarming, it was just like laugh out loud, like comical, and this would make a really good like Netflix movie. I could totally see this, like watching this on screen and laughing like out loud to it, because I think there's just so many crazy moments in it that are just made to like come to life on screen. I loved the family, like the drama in it, and how Maddie was so annoyed at her auntie for most of the book, but also like the great love that was there between them at the same time. That definitely like made the entire book for me, was this like family connection between all the characters. I just loved that so much. This was really good. I gave it a really strong 4 out of 5 stars, and I definitely recommend. Then I read The Miseducation of Evie, Epworth. This was by Matson Taylor, and this is a book I read for Lauren and the Book's Patreon book club. And this is a book that is set in the 60s, and we are following a character called Evie, who is kind of on the cusp of, you know, she's kind of leaving her teenage years almost, and she's on the verge of becoming a woman, and she's kind of figuring out like what she wants to do next. She's a bit of like a happy-go-lucky type of character, like everything is kind of joyous and wonderful. She just enjoys her life for what it is, and she does have a bit of a problem though. That happens to be her dad's girlfriend, who used to be their housekeeper, is now like his much younger girlfriend, who seems to be trying to like marry him, but she's marrying him for all the wrong reasons. She's clearly after her father's money, and she's a little bit of like an evil character, and Evie has to figure out how to get rid of her and like how to get her out of their lives. This was like fun. It was fine. I did find it a little bit like very black and white in a way. Like Evie was very like, you know, as I said, really happy-go-lucky, really out there, really bubbly, and then the characters who were like mean or evil, like that's all they were. Like they were almost like stupidly like mean and evil. Like it was real kind of like, you know, evil stepmother, like almost like Disney-like in like their villainous. And I don't know, I just kind of expected like a little bit more substance to those characters, and there just wasn't really any there. There was some language as well, particularly at the very start of this book, that I felt was a little bit like fat shamey as well, and just a little bit problematic in how like language was used to describe people in like a really negative way when it came to their weight. The time period this is set in, which is like the 60s, I did think was really, really fun. They were actually really, really like stories set in the UK around like the 50s and 60s, so you're kind of like that post-war era, like things are starting to get good again, and there's the eve of like the boys from Liverpool in this book as well, which obviously the Beatles, and that was like just a really fun element of Evie listening to a Beatles record for the first time before anyone else has ever heard them. And yeah, I just really like that, which is kind of a fun element to the book. But overall, like this book was just fine for me. I didn't absolutely hate it, but I didn't love it either, and yeah, I was kind of happy when it was over. So yeah, it was just a kind of a meh kind of book for me, so I gave it like a 2.5 to a 3 star. And after that I picked up a really anticipated book for me, and that was She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is a historical fantasy book. It's kind of like a gender bent story about the rise of the Ming dynasty in China. And we were following a character called Zhu, who after her father and her brother die in famine, she ends up taking her brother's identity, and she lives basically the rest of her life being her brother. Now she portrays herself as male, and she definitely doesn't identify as a female, but throughout this book she does use she, her pronouns, so that is why I'm using them as well. But there's definitely a lot of like gender like identity explored in this book, and Zhu does often have like an inner like monologue about how she feels about herself, how she does not feel female, but maybe not necessarily male either. She goes from an orphan to a monk to a rebel commander, where we know eventually she is going to become like possibly emperor of all China. And I just really enjoy like this book is definitely like a lot of build up. I feel like the second book in this series or trilogy is going to be quite epic, because I feel like this book was really good in terms of building up Zhu as a character, and kind of seeing how she kind of becomes a little bit more like morally grey near the end of this book, and the things she will do to get ahead and to become like the great person that like that she believes is her destiny. Like she believes she is destined to be great, and that is like she's determined to do that. Another character in this who is a eunuch, and I actually don't know how to properly pronounce their name or his name, so I'm not going to say it, but his character, he's like on the other side of Zhu, so he's kind of like Zhu's enemy, and he's a eunuch, and because of like he feels very masculine, but because of obviously he looks a certain way because he became a eunuch when he was quite young, and he's looked down upon as that, and he's almost looked upon as monstrous or disgusting in a way by other people. And he was just such a tortured soul, and I loved him a lot. And there were just some scenes between him and a friend of his who's also kind of like an enemy that were like so torturous. Like it's kind of one of those these things where, like, you know, when two people are in a room together and you just want them to kiss. That's kind of what I felt like this whole time that this character was with his friend, who like they had a lot of feelings towards each other, and a lot of them were a little bit like complicated, but like that whole time I just wanted them to kiss on the page. So yeah, this book I did really, really enjoy. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Definitely like looking forward to the next book, and yeah, I definitely think like the next book, I feel like this built up to a really epic second book, so I'm really, really hoping that comes true. And then I picked up a book for the July word for Buzzwordathon, which was the word last, and I picked up The Last by Hanna Jameson, which is a book that I had on NetGalley. This is a dystopian like thriller-esque book that I've had for a few years that I've needed to read, and this book is set in Switzerland. We are following a bunch of people who were in this hotel in like the mountains in Switzerland when basically the end of the world happened. Nuclear war a bunch of cities were destroyed by nuclear bombs, and now these people are left in this hotel. They're not getting any news. There's no signal, like there's no news, there's no internet. They don't know what's going on. They can only presume their countries are gone. There's no government, and they're left in this hotel trying to figure out what's going on. We are following the story via like a bunch of like diary journal entries from this man who is a history professor, and we're following the story from his point of view through these diary entries, and we're finding out like what like the survivors are doing, who they all are, where they're all from. And then we also find out that one day this body of a little girl is found on the roof of this hotel, and none of them have ever seen this little girl before. They don't know where she came from. It appears that maybe she's been dead from like the first day of like of the new world basically. And our protagonist kind of takes it upon himself to start investigating and start finding out what might have gone wrong, what might have happened to this little girl. This book was fine. I enjoyed the start of it much better than like the second half. The second half kind of petered off and became a little bit boring in a way and a little bit silly. The ending was really stupid of this book. Like, I didn't like the ending at all. It wasn't as thrilling or as like horrific as I wanted it to be. Like, when you're thinking of like dystopian and you're thinking of the end of the world, you kind of want a little bit of a thrill, a little bit of like on the edge, like what's going to happen. Is there going to be violence? Is there going to be gore? Is there going to be like a lot of murder? Is there danger? And I just didn't really feel like there was a lot of that going on. So yeah, I felt a little bit disappointed by this book overall. I gave it a 2.5 out of 5 stars. Then I finished a second audiobook, and that was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I've read this before, so I'm not going to like go into full details about what I think of this book, but this was the first time I read it on audiobook. I'd heard the audiobook was really good. Can completely say that is true. This is a book that is based around a band in the 60s and 70s. This is probably like one of the best audiobooks I've ever listened to, if not the best audiobook I've ever listened to, because it's all told completely in interview format. You genuinely forget, and there's a full cast, so you genuinely forget that you're listening to a book. You think you're listening to like a documentary. And I just think everything, the way they did this book, the people they chose for narrators, the way those narrators portray their characters, it's just so authentic. It is so real. I definitely recommend consuming this book in both formats if you can, like either reading it first and then listening to the audiobook, or listening and then reading it on a reread. But it was just brilliant. 5 out of 5 stars. Like, can't fault it. Amazing. Those are all the books that I read in July. A big list as usual. Please let me know what you guys think. I would love to know, and I'll see you guys again next time. Bye.